Okay, well this week we're looking at the one another command that's found in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Now, if you know anything about the Corinthian church, you know that they were constantly failing to live out the gospel in their lives and in their community of believers. And so Paul, the Apostle Paul, wrote to them several times seeking to instruct them and correct them in the numerous areas that they were getting wrong. And so 1 Corinthians chapter 11 is one such example of Paul seeking to correct them. And so what's going on in this chapter is that the early church loved to gather together for feasts. And one such feast that they would gather for was called the Love Feast. And it's actually mentioned in Jude verse 12. And at the end of these feasts, the church would celebrate then the Lord's Supper together. Well, the Corinthian church, they loved to gather for these feasts, but instead of using them as these opportunities for the church to gather together, to encourage one another and build one another up, they were used actually selfishly to just gorge themselves with food and drink. And so it became this time of gluttonous abuse. And it also turned into a time of division as the wealthy would bring lots of food and drink, but to fail to share it with the poor. And so the rich would leave the feast fat and drunk, and the poor would walk away hungry. And so this is why we see in 1 Corinthians 11 the instructions that Paul gave to the church on how to gather together to remember the Lord's Supper. So we see those specific instructions in verses 23 through 26. And then he wraps up this section by writing to the church where he gives them just this one another command that we see in verse 33 where he says, "Brothers, when you come together to eat, wait for one another." And so another way of saying this command is that we're to share with one another. And so the reason Paul highlights the instructions and purpose for the Lord's Supper is to show them and us how the gospel has broken down the dividing wall of hostility that once divided us. That it's now through Christ that we are all one, that we are all rich in Christ. And so when we reflect and when we remember the gospel, it begins to shatter our self-centeredness. And as we look to Christ and we realize that it was Jesus who came to us, who we were poor and wretched and in need of grace, it changes then how we treat and care for one another. We don't seek anymore to show favoritism to only the rich and powerful, but we embrace the poor and the weak. We welcome them in with open arms because that is exactly what Jesus did for us. And so as you read and think through this text tonight in your groups, discuss what ways that we're still seeing division in the church today. How are we caring for the poor? How are we sharing with those who are in need? How does the gospel break down those barriers that so often divide us? You see, the gospel frees us from having to find our value and our worth in the applause of others. And so whether you're rich or poor, you have everything you need in Christ. And so church, we want to share with one another. So study well tonight with your groups, church, and let's grow in grace.